Thank you. My name is Fabrian. Yes, we agree that Islamic political party never get the fully support from the Muslim majority in Indonesia. But if we see that current development, especially in the last 2 years, maybe beyond the election, beyond that, beyond the formal politics, they get they're taking stage lah. Mainly because of this FPI, Hizbut Tahrir, during the last Jakarta governor elections, and just yesterday, I think they are the only groups in Indonesia right now, regardless the ideology of everything, that can organize the mass demonstrations participated by, let's say, the 50,000, 100,000. This Islamic hardliners group, the only organizations or the only groups can organize the mass demonstration. And also we expect that next presidential election in the less than 2 years. And then yesterday they just play the communist card. Say, yeah, you are very optimistic with how the Indonesian handle the communal violence, but we also understand that the communist issue is the only issue that we never deal better, right, in Indonesia. Yeah, of course, because the complexity of the event, because the more than 30 years of silence and everything. But Gus Dur, the one of the have to try to reconcile, but also is got the opposition by the large of society. Then how you project that this development related to this event. And one more questions. You wrote about the where Abangan gone, right? I think that for those who are not familiar with, especially Malaysian who are not familiar with the Islam in Indonesia, especially in Java, can you elaborate more about this? And my question is also the same. Where Abangan gone, and why it's matter to ask this question in the Indonesian today? Thank you. Okay.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Corey, I'm from Indonesia. Actually, since yesterday, it's a little bit confused for me because nowadays so many terminologies appears in our life, just like civil Muslims, progressive Muslim, liberal, or something like that. And I think our discussion will be only understood by educated people. So I think that the more educated I become, and the more confused I become, something like that. So actually, my question is just like what we are discussing today about an ideology, right? And also we believe that another movement also they have their own ideology, and I come with an ideology they have, just like on ayah walan tardo angkal yahudu walan nasoro, something like that, right? And some of Muslims do believe that the Christian and Jewish will not please until Muslims follow their religion. From your personal opinion, what do you see about this ayah? Because from this ayah, they become, what do we call, su'uzon with everything, the progressive efforts from other Muslims to make Islam more reliable to be practiced in our nowadays. Thank you.
Okay. My question is very simple, Prof. From someone that don't have anthropological and sociological background, I think there is overemphasis on the normative part of the civil Islam. And where is the role of the institutions in provide the stability? And the stability is important in order the civil Islam to have this kind of engagement and have a dialogue and whatsoever. I think that's one thing that we not hardly discuss in you're not hardly discuss in the presentations. So I wonder what actually the roles of institutions in civil Islam is one thing. Another thing, if we talk about the institutions to provide the stability, means we're talking about the strong state. So there is always contestations how far the state have go into the public life. So how do you see the role of institutions in civil Islam? Thank you.
You are very optimistic when you were talking about the challenge that the Indonesians are facing right now. Though you do admit that the transnational Islamist group do exist, but they are vocal minority. But if you read the narrative in the Western media, they are viewed otherwise, as if we were not to listen to you today, we are going to believe that the dominant discourse, the one on the ground that is followed by the majority of the Indonesian, is not the traditionalists, the moderate Muslims, but the one that is exclusive Saudi influence. So what do you comment on that? Thank you.
The first question had to do with the effectiveness of the Front Pembela Islam and other organizations at mobilizing large masses of people to causes that I think many people would regard, many of my Muslim friends in Indonesia and elsewhere, regard as contrary to the principles, aspirations, and hopes of a civil Islam, as well as just Indonesian democracy. And yes, the communist card has been played, and yes, Gus Dur Abdurrahman Wahid, who was actually a pretty close friend of mine, even though I was never a Gus Durian. In fact, yeah, I won't joke about Durian, but at any rate, he was a good friend of mine, but we didn't see eye to eye on all things. I never contradicted him because he was my senior and he was eventually president of Indonesia. So, but he too tried to bring about reconciliation with the people who came from communist families and of whom many survivors had continued to suffer discrimination. So let me break up that answer very quickly in two parts. One about the FPI, which I'll answer secondly. The second about reconciliation with PKI, with the Communist Party. I'm not optimistic that reconciliation with PKI is going to make much progress. And I do think that I wish that were otherwise. But, and I do think, I worked in a village many years ago, in 1985 in East Java, which was a very Muslim, it was an NU village. But it had an Abangan nominal Muslim minority that had been primarily nationalists associated with the Partai Nasionalis Indonesia, but it also had been on a lesser scale communist. And the communists had organized people who, so they had suffered. Many of them had been killed by NU people, the same NU people who were my friends in this village, people from a Pondok Pesantren. So I share this concern and understand the situation deeply understand the situation of communists and the survivors from communist families. I think that this is going to remain an issue that's going to be unresolved indefinitely. Mr. Oppenheimer's film I didn't care for, about the act of killing. I thought it, primarily because it wasn't the Indonesia I recognized. I've done many interviews with people who were very active in the campaign to kill communists. I will say this. One of my closest friends was a Muhammadiyah activist in Malang in the 1970s and 80s, who had been a lead organizer in the rounding up and killing of communists. And he was one of my best friends. He didn't only reveal this to me 10 years later. So at any rate, but from him, from my many friends, from working with Sharikat, observing them, they were attempting to effect reconciliation, primarily between NU people and PKI in East and Central Java. I've watched this, and I have to say, no, I'm afraid it's not going to make much progress. It should remain an issue, but I think the issue that should be put to the fore, and that when I watch activists in Indonesia and intellectuals, they realize that this cannot be made a core issue because we cannot win. So what you do is you try to neutralize it. You try to make sure people cannot play that card, but you do so in part by not emphasizing that that's the first among the issues that you think are a priority for Indonesia and the Muslim community today. I'm sorry to say that for some people. When I say this to the Oppenheimer fans, the filmmaker, or to Oppenheimer himself, whom I really don't agree with. I think he's basically anti-Muslim, if I can say so. Maafkan saja. I think he's basically anti-Muslim. And I also think he's arrogant towards Indonesia, because he doesn't show us the real complex. But in any case, I do agree that this is not going to be an easily resolved issue. In the meantime, attention needs to go elsewhere. And the major challenge that's facing Indonesia is the first of the ones that you mentioned. It's the rise of Islamist paramilitaries, many of which are not primarily transnationalists. The FPI is very interesting. Many of them are sort of from the conservative wing of Nahdlatul Ulama. So these are my brothers and my sisters. I work both Anu and Muhammadiyah. Historically, when I worked in East Java, most of the Anu I worked with were not Gus Durians. They were very conservative Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah folks. Not like the FPI, because they worked within the law. And they were, very importantly, proud nationalists. And they believed in the idea, the principles of Panchasila pluralism, and thought those were Islamic. But there's the difference. And there's where I think it's taken a long time, but we see that Anu and Muhammadiyah and other mainstream organizations, they don't want to make this the main issue. They don't want to attack FPI and say, ban it. But they realize we have to do something, because these people are very skilled. They use media. They use SMS, social media, very, very brilliantly. And yes, they can mobilize large numbers of people. And yes, if you look at the statistics, if you look at Syaiful Mujani's Lembaga Survey Indonesia, you see that the number of people who have kind of hard views towards religious minorities has increased a little bit. And the number who support, anti-maksiat actions is even higher. I differentiate these things. I think the anti-maksiat campaigns, it's too bad they're outside the law, but most of them are targeting things that are understandable. Alcohol, prostitution. In Tasik Malaya, in West Java that I go to often, some Muslims, women's groups from Muhammadiyah and Anu and other groups have actually worked with some of the anti-maksiat groups to prevent trafficking, which in West Java, trafficking in women and girls, which is a horrific problem, because there is an international prostitution network that links West Java especially with areas in the Middle East, Ma'afia. But it's my sisters in Anu and various women's organizations, and they say, look, okay, just work where you can find partners. And if some of them are, anti-maksiat groups, nah, baba. Mari kita berdialog. And they find ways to work. And that's the way to work. But it's going to remain a challenge. Anu and Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Watan and other groups have been slow to sort of recognize that they are being pushed back by this new style of social organization. But I think they are mobilizing, and I think the center will hold. But we're going to see in this more open environment continuing attacks on minorities and people playing the anti-Ahmadiyya card, playing the anti-Shia card. I'm very confident but Pa Zainal can correct me here. I'm confident that the Shia thing can be worked out. The Ahmadi thing, for the reasons that Pa Alatas talked about earlier, is much more serious. The point is to bring it in to a constitutional civic framework, not to allow it to be managed through wildcat attacks, aksi sufiha, which is what the FPI does. Second point, this was Bu Kori. Too many terms, too many acronyms, too many big ideas and stuff. This is true. And actually, I hear this often in Indonesia, not from me, but when people talk about, Nakholish Majid, they say, oh, Nakholish Majid, his language was beautiful, but if you didn't have if you hadn't gone to perguruan tinggi and got your S3, your doctorate, you really couldn't understand a lot of it. So you had to sort of take it on faith. And this is a shortcoming. Noholish Majid, I might add, was very aware of this. So if people don't often realize this, but he published a number of popular books that took his complicated ideas and made them very enak dibaca. And we need more of that. We need more of that. The Muslim community, I think, is doing that. But it is a problem. It's a problem all over the world. It's a problem in the United States, in a non-Muslim setting, where you have all these democratic intellectuals, some of whom are conservatives, some of whom are liberals, some of whom are in the center. But they're using a similar vocabulary and language, and then a populist like Trump comes along and just says, hit him in the mouth, get him out of here. If I compare his vocabulary with Habib Rizik's vocabulary, the director, the chair of FPAE, who is more prone to violent statements? It's the President of the United States. Look at his statement about North Korea. My ears were shocked. We're saying we're going to wipe out a country. This is biadab. This is beyond limits. But in any case, so it happens everywhere, and you have to struggle to make the vocabulary of civil Islam, of democracy, the imbrication of Islamic values into democratic citizenship and pluralism and kewarganegaraan, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Indonesia, Malaysia, or wherever. You just have to work constantly, and you need people who can speak in the language of ordinary folks. And sometimes intellectual Muslims, like intellectual Catholics, Christians, and secular pluralists in the United States or Western Europe, they don't realize you have to be patient. Harus sabar. And this is, I think, a lesson that, just a quick side note here, a lesson that I take away from my many years in Indonesia, especially, is that I belajar dari Indonesia, and that the khatib and imams who are really good, really are, their genius lies in their ability to take complex ideas, give them a religious coloring, and then communicate them to a broader audience. In the United States, in the Muslim community, a quick reference, there's one man whom I know who happens to be a friend. His name is Ibrahim Musa. Ibrahim Musa, you may know some of his works. He's the... Okay, so he's been a guest. Ibrahim Musa is a friend, and he too, I've heard him as a khatib at a mosque in South Bend, Indiana, and my eyes were, I just was in tears, because he has that ability, and that's not an easy ability, but that is what one needs to communicate and to create the civic culture without which democracy, and the civic Islam without which democracy in Muslim majority societies cannot flourish. What about this ayat about Christians? Christians and Jews will never, will never accept you until you accept their religion. I'm not going to do what Ahok did in Indonesia. And this is your it's not mine to interpret an ayat. But I can comment on what my Muslim friends tell me about that ayat, and others say, well, that was in a particular context of revelation. The revelation, God was giving the prophet instructions to deal with very concrete issues as well as long-lasting issues. And you have to distinguish between those. And so there are people, and you know this, who will say, no, that's Christians and Muslims and Jews can work together. In the case of Israel, I'm afraid this is not an easy task, and I won't go into that, but there are challenges. In any case, the last question. Where's the role of, from Pak Haris or sebelum, and what's your name? I'm sorry? Oh, you are Haris, okay. What's the role of institutions? There are different institutions. And the thing that I said yesterday is that civil Islam, like civic pluralism in the United States or in the West, it works ultimately by entangling the values of civic pluralism kewarganegaraan atau civil Islam, entangling them both in the lives and sociabilities, the everyday interactions of ordinary people, making them part of their lived reality. But it also, and I use a phrase here from a Berkeley political scientist named Peter Evans, who's written quite a bit about social capital. in the end, a civil Islam, like a civic pluralist tradition in the West, has to get away from the mythology of the 1980s and 1990s that civil society is always separate from, apart from the state. It has to have a measure of autonomy. But for certain critical issues, there has to be, to use Peter Evans' term, a collaboration across the state-society divide. If you look at the history of democracy in the United States, let me take an example of a man whom I admire very much, Martin Luther King. He happens to be from Boston University, where I'm from. He got his PhD at Boston University. Praise God. And so Martin Luther King used the vocabulary of African American Christian spirituality and said it's not just for African Americans, it's for and it's not just for Christians. It's for the entire public. And people rallied to it. They heard it. It was a religious vocabulary, but for those who were moved, they said, wah, ini seperti bagian dari saya. It was the same thing, recognizing in a religious vocabulary something that is part of you, even if you were from a different religious tradition. But equally importantly, where is our institutions? Martin Luther King realized the civil rights movement would not succeed until it achieved these collaborations across the state-society divide. So civil society is properly understood. It guards a measure of autonomy, but it's not an opponent to the state. It's a partner for the inculcation of pluralism, kewargaan, civic pluralist values, and in a Muslim majority society, pluralism, kewargaan, ala civil Islam. Lastly, so the last question was, yes, I sound optimistic. No, I don't think I'm optimistic. And then you said, if you read the Western media, it sounds as if Indonesia and the Muslim world is going to collapse. Well, the Arab Spring has, as I said, caused great kind of gloominess, doom and gloom, and a revival of Sam Huntington views. That's part of what's going on. But in Indonesia, it's really, there's still a surprising measure of confidence that in Western media circles. You have to go beyond just CNN and look at those Western media like the New York Times that has reporters in Southeast Asia full time. And there you get a more nuanced story. Not tremendously nuanced, but a more nuanced story. And yes, there's a kind of, I think, excessive degree of worry that the Front Pembela Islam somehow represents the majority of Indonesians. It does represent, it's not 1%, it does represent 15% or so. So it's there, and it's dedicated, it's organized, it's militant, so it exercises influence. It hits outside of its, sort of league. But that said, I think if one looks at the broader course of Indonesian history, a measure of confidence, I wouldn't call it optimism, is still deserved. That the democratic institutions are functioning, the Muslim social welfare organizations continue to flourish. Yes, they are being challenged. Hizbut Tahrir is all over the place, and it's made inroads in some surprising circles. I know Hizbut Tahrir people quite well. I've interviewed them dozens of times, and they actually sort of see me as somebody who's okay. They tend not to like Western analysts, but they sort of welcome me and say, okay, you're not too bad, so okay. But Hizbut Tahrir has made some remarkable inroads in certain very well educated and even teaching circles. So that's a reality, but one has to look at the general process, which is that though, yes, there are certain tensions, the Christianization issue worries many people, including mainstream Muslims, like Amin Rais. Okay, I can understand that. If you look at West Java, I don't want to get off on a thing, but if you look at West Java, and if you look at what's happened in the Protestant community, and I have many friends who are Pentecostal and evangelical, but the rise of Pentecostalism in Indonesia has been accompanied by some in the Pentecostal community saying the old consensus as to how one proselytized no longer works, because we have to take the sweet message of redemption and salvation to everyone. Okay, Muslims feel the same way, but that's not part of the Kalimatun Sawa that was agreed on in the Pancasila and in the constitutionalism. So you have to recognize limits. You have to respect your neighbors. But there are these problems. They're going to remain, but these are not emergencies, they are irritants. The general course of the development of the middle class, of education, and above all, of an understanding of Islamic values that recognizes, and I don't want to get into slogans, I don't like to say formal Islam versus substantive Islam. It's all substantive Islam. But it's a substantive Islam that locates a hope and a confidence in this idea that the best values of Islamic tradition, whether in fiqh or in tasawwuf, for those who explore tasawwuf, or in kalam, the best values are very relevant for today, and if properly implemented, they actually strengthen the grounds for pluralist citizenship and democracy. And in this regard, though there will be setbacks, maybe even electoral setbacks, I think Indonesia is actually going to continue to move forward over the long term. Yes, yes, I am optimistic.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Hefner. I would like to call for a round of applause. Indeed, from my experience, this is one of the most comprehensive and also interesting discussion, mainly comparative discourse, Malaysia, Indonesia, and how the overall dynamic relates to Islam and state in particular. Okay, so before we go to our another important session, which is lunch, okay, of course, I just want to remind you that our next session after lunch is a group workshop session. I will be the one conducting that session as well. And that will start at 2:30, and so we have still got like 1 hour and 30 minutes for lunch to go through the buffet, and of course the surah is at the back of this hall. Just want to remind you all that please be, pardon? And extra advice by the director is also don't go back to your room. For me, as long as you're here 2:30, I'm fine. Alright, because 2:30 is when we're going to start. Okay, thanks to Prof. Hefner again. We are still going to have Prof. Hefner in the forum session tomorrow morning, so we will continue the interesting discussion. And for now, I think we can go to lunch. And tonight, we are going to have from Dr. Zainal Bagir for another talk session. Okay, so we can go to lunch now and see you at 2:30.